And we are live. Welcome, comrades, on the eve of International Workers' Day. I hope you're all doing well. Today, we're going to be diving into a topic, well, of much contention on the left, the experience of the Peruvian Communist Party, what we can learn from it, addressing various misconceptions of the Peruvian people's struggle, and taking your questions and answering them throughout the stream. Now, today, I'm joined by Comrade Vučko to dive
You're
into
not
this piece.
live.
Oh, no?
You're not. Yeah, you're not. I'm looking at the stream right now. It just says it's still showing the. Oh, now you're live. There we go.
That's the lag. That's the lag. I think we are live. I think there's just a little bit of
Yeah,
a lag.
yeah.
But,
I can see the stream now. Sorry for like
no, it's okay.
interrupting you.
It's okay. It's okay. There's a slight little bit. I can hear like an echo of the YouTube. So maybe if you want to just mute the YouTube
Yeah,
video.
yeah. I turned the tab off because it was lagging and it would be useless for me to look at it.
Oh yeah, you can keep it open maybe and mute it for the chat so you can see there and,
Yeah,
and then it'll be fine. All right, take two. Let's do it.
yeah.
Let's give this another go. All right, great. Thanks everybody for being here. It's going to be really interesting to talk with this. It is a very contentious topic on the left, and I'm really looking forward to diving into it. And today I'm joined by Comrade Vučko to dive into this and to really look into this international proletarian struggle for national liberation and socialism, and to help us better understand the experience of the comrades in Peru. This is an interesting topic for me because I didn't come into Marxism, Leninism, Maoism through looking at the experience of the PCP. I very much came into it from looking at the experience in the Philippines. I very much look into like Joma and these kinds of people. So this is kind of in the Marxist-Leninist Maoist movement, there's a little bit of a division. There's kind of like there's a left wing and there's a right wing. As within everything, there's always this kind of one divides into two. We all know this, and I think that it seems to me that the PCP, the comrades in Brazil, would more so fall kind of on the left of the MLM movement, and then maybe organizations like the CPP, MPA, so on like that, so on and so forth in the Philippines would more fall into the right of that. And then I think maybe like the CPI Maoist in India would be more of kind of like a centrist-y kind of position. So yeah, anyway, it'll be interesting to look into this more and to learn more and to parse it out and to discuss it. There's a lot of misconceptions out there, and we're looking forward to having the conversation. So, Vučko, thank you for taking the time out to come on the stream. Please introduce yourself to the audience, telling people a little bit about your background, your political work, your ideology, and how you came to the left generally.
Yo. What's up, everyone? Thanks for having me on again. I'm. Well, all I have to say is that I'm a Marxist-Leninist Maoist, and I work with Oktober Förlaget here in Sweden. And I came to the left through mostly my grandparents and like hearing stuff about Yugoslavia, which is when I became a Titoist and stuff. But later on, I started developing and learning more, which led me to Maoism, and particularly the PCP and the contributions to Maoism from there.
Did you go through like you said you were like a Titoist? Did you go through Marxism, Leninism, and then gradually move over?
Yeah, but my ML period was very like short, because the way I stopped being a Titoist was because of the CPC document called "Is Yugoslavia a Socialist Country?"
Oh, that's great.
And because I read that document, I immediately got interested in like reading more from the CPC, which immediately started making me into like a ML Mao Zedong thought kind of person. And then I was kind of on the fence for a while because I was very confused about the question of China. So I wasn't sure if I wanted to call myself MLM because I knew that Maoists didn't consider China to be a socialist country, and that MZT, some people who claim that they are Marxist-Leninist Mao Zedong thought, support China and consider it to be a socialist country. But then later on, I found out more about China and like learned what I should have known, and that China is today a social imperialist country and not a socialist country, and that anybody with half a brain should oppose China. So yeah, I guess I never went through a actual ML period, other than like if you would consider Titoists to be MLs as some of them claim to be.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Very, very interesting and very interesting transition. I can understand the difficulty when it comes to trying to understand the nature of China, modern China as well, because they sort of claim to be, market socialist, and especially if you're coming from like a Titoist background and that is kind of like the quintessential market socialism, that's going to be a confusing question. There's going to be big questions about whether or not it's a dictatorship of the proletariat, whether or not market socialism is socialism. And those are the kinds of questions which are often very, very difficult, especially to newcomers to the left to really parse out. Especially if you haven't engaged that much with Marxism, maybe if you don't really have like a firm grasp on what capitalism is, how that process occurs, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So it can be very, very difficult when you're starting out, and
Exactly,
even,
because like
even for seasoned leftists, it can be still quite challenging.
yeah. A big thing was that like when I read this document about Yugoslavia, and then I looked at the modern China, I was like, wait a minute, they're doing the same thing that they're criticizing in this document, like all of the capitalist elements in the countryside and the cities of Yugoslavia. All of these elements are now like prominent in China today, the same way they were in Yugoslavia, of course, with a slightly different nature, because Yugoslavia was a semi-colonial country and not an imperialist power like China is today.
Mm. Mm. All right, brilliant. Thank you very much. I also want to say, I don't know if I said it at the start, we're going to be doing questions and answers throughout the stream. So please, any questions you have, just pop them into the live chats. Just write at Paul Moran. I'll see them. It'll highlight my name. I'll take them down. I'll write them down on little documents that I have here, on a little Google Doc that we have, and we'll work through them throughout the stream. So today's going to be a little bit more interactive than the last couple of streams, and we're going to make it a little bit more, we'll keep it, let's say, dialectical. let's fuck around. Let's be loosey goosey with that term, with what that means. All right. So thank you very much, Vučko. Let's jump into it. Let's jump into the PCP and the Peruvian Communist Party. Why don't you go ahead and give us a general overview about the PCP and its work over the years?
Well, let's start from like the beginning. Okay, so basically, like, there's this man who was called Abimael Guzman, who today we know as Chairman Gonzalo, and he was part of the red fraction of the old Communist Party of Peru, and he went to China during the Cultural Revolution, and he was educated in China on how to do like sabotage and like other revolutionary things. He mentions this in the interview where he talks about how they were taught how to turn anything into an explosive. Which is, you can find it in the interview. I won't read up the quote. And like when he came back to Peru, he had all these lessons from China, which he started spreading because he was a university teacher in the start. And he started spreading these things to the like local section of the party. And that's when this fraction became known as the Communist Party of Peru Red Fraction. This is the first formation of the PCP that we see, because they were still part of the old PCP. But they were a red fraction within it. And they upheld the contributions of Mao, and they moved toward synthesizing this into like applying it to Peru. And eventually the old PCP broke down, like it stopped existing as the PCP and became a bunch of different fractions, the largest of which was this Mao Zedong thought based one, which is the one led by Chairman Gonzalo. The other ones were, for example, Patria Roja and Peruvian Communist Party, as opposed to the Communist Party of Peru, and other such smaller revisionist and rightist organizations that maybe upheld the Khrushchevite USSR or sided with Deng Xiaoping and such. And the Red Fraction had like various armed actions, which is not to be confused with armed struggle, such as the initiation of People's War. They had various armed actions and such, and they did a bit of like mass work and such, and built not base areas, but like support in different areas of the country until like 1980. I'm skipping a bit ahead in time. Until 1980, when they decided that it is time to initiate a People's War the way they did in China. And they initiated this People's War in 1980. And the first action, I believe, was they shot some cops with a revolver and burned a ballot box because they in 1980 there was also elections in Peru. These were the first democratic elections in like a few decades because like Peru was a military dictatorship before 1980, and they initiated this armed struggle and they called it a people's war. And through this armed struggle, they started synthesizing Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought into what today we know as Marxism, Leninism, Maoism. And yeah, that's pretty much like the basic start of the PCP as we know them today. And under this course, there was several like armed actions and conflicts which have sort of become infamous. One of which is Lucanamarca, which happened in 1983, and I'll touch on that a little later when we're answering questions. But yeah, essentially, and an interesting thing is that like the first Congress that this new Communist Party of Peru held was 8 years after the People's War had already started. Like it was in 1988, and this is where the documents on Marxism, Leninism, Maoism concerning Gonzalo thought, the party's political program, and the general political line come from, which kind of spits in the face of some revisionists who are like, oh, we need to prepare and accumulate forces before we can do anything revolutionary, because like they were still waging a successful struggle up until 1988, despite not having a first organized Congress, and like they managed to take over. By the 90s, they managed to take over like 70% of the country, and it was very successful. And like they didn't really have a Congress before that. So like then Chairman Gonzalo was obviously arrested in 1992, as many of us know, and a new campaign was started by the Peruvian state along with the help of the CIA to like fabricate that Chairman Gonzalo was pushing for capitulationism, and that a section of the Communist Party went along with this, and they became known as the Right Opportunist line, or ROL, as you can see them in some international communist documents referred to, or in Spanish they are known as LOD, which I don't remember what it stands for in Spanish. But yeah, and these guys today are known as Movadef, who are a political party in Peru. And one of the political candidates for president, what's his name, Castillo, is being accused of having connections to them, which is pretty funny. But yeah, there's this capitulationist line that is pushing the line that, oh, Chairman Gonzalo wants peace, and they're talking about people's war through like peaceful methods, which is hilarious, like talking about people's war without armed struggle. However, Chairman Gonzalo himself debunked this lie that he is for peace by enduring one trial, which was in 2018, I believe. He stood up and raised his fist and declared "Viva la lucha armada," which means "Long live the armed struggle," which is pretty much just saying like, "Oh, well, fuck you guys. I'm not for like disarming the party." So the Communist Party of Peru is currently ongoing in a reorganization effort, and the People's War is still ongoing during this time. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the reorganization being completed and the People's War starting to develop even more again. So yeah, that's pretty much like a short overview of the history. I didn't want to go into a lot of details because I believe like most of the stuff will be answered in like further down.
Yeah, definitely.
In questions.
We'll definitely get into all of the, because there are a lot of like misconceptions, stuff like that. There's also a lot of contextual stuff, which I think is very important whenever if we want to get a truly deep understanding of what happened there. We need to look at the context. We need to look at the historical precedents in terms of the people's struggle in Peru. We need to look at people like I can never pronounce his name, but I think it's Mariategui, something like that. Pronunciation wise, we need to look at like what they were talking about and
Mariategui.
Yeah, like that yeah. That pronunciation. Yeah, so we need to look at this background and really put it in that kind of context, because a lot of people tend to look at the struggle in Peru from their standpoint, from their perspective. They they sort of see it from a very like kind of privileged position. They don't really understand the brutal reality, the brutal context. They don't understand these fascist governments committing like mass murder, slaughtering people. They don't really understand that, and so this can cause all kinds of misconceptions and misperceptions and all kinds of issues. And so this will be a good conversation to have to really maybe get to the bottom of some of those misconceptions. Now, one of the things that you brought up there in the conversation was this issue of Lucanomarca and stuff like that. So you touched on that. We had a Q&A before this got started. Excuse me, we had a question, and we're gonna try and answer it. Speckle asked this before we got the stream started. All right, I'm gonna give a little warning. We're going straight into probably the most horrific. The most horrific accusation that is made against the PCP. And this is the so-called baby boiling accusation, the 1983 Lucanomarca massacre in general. Speckle asks, is this just propaganda? Was the event fabricated? And I suppose the big question there is this happen? Did the PCP boil babies?
Well, the boiling babies part is a complete lie. I've never actually seen this claim substantiated anywhere outside of like Twitter. And I believe it has its origins on Twitter, and the fact that like some people think that the PCP boiled a pregnant woman, I guess, and that in that meaning that they boiled babies, because like usually when you say baby boiling, people don't think of like killing a pregnant woman. They think of like grabbing an actual baby and putting it into boiling water. So that actual claim itself is fabricated. Whether or not they killed a pregnant woman or not, I don't know. There's nothing on this. There's nothing from the Peruvian state that says this, as far as I know, and not to say that they're a trustworthy source at all. Like they would probably just say something to make it sound even worse. But the Communist Party of Peru has never commented on what is who died in Lucanomarca. However, Lucanomarca definitely did happen. The battle there did happen, and Chairman Gonzalo actually has a quote about this in the interview. Which, if it's okay, I'm going to read it up now.
Yeah, by all means.
In the face of reactionary military actions and the use of mesendas, we responded with a devastating action, Lucanomarca. Neither they nor we have forgotten it, to be sure, because they got an answer that they didn't imagine possible. More than 80 were annihilated. That is the truth. And we say openly that there were excesses, as was analyzed in 1983. But everything in life has two aspects. Our task was to deal a devastating blow in order to put them in check, to make them understand that it was not going to be so easy. On some occasions, like that one, it was the central leadership itself that planned the action and gave instructions. That's how it was. In that case, the principal thing is that we dealt them a devastating blow, and we checked them, and they understood that they were dealing with a different kind of people's fighters. We weren't the same as those they had fought before. That is what they understood. The excesses are the negative aspect. Understanding war and basing ourselves on what Lenin said. Taking Clausewitz into account. In war, the masses engaged in combat can go too far and express all their hatred, their deep feelings of class hatred, repudiation and condemnation that they have. That was the root of it. This has been explained by Lenin very clearly. Excesses can be committed. The problem is to go to a certain point and not beyond it. Because if you go past that point, you go off course. It is like an angle. It can be opened up to a certain point and no further. If we were to give the masses a lot of restrictions, requirements, and prohibitions, it would mean that deep down we don't want the waters to overflow. And what we needed was for the waters to overflow, to let the flood rage, because we know that when a river floods its banks, it causes devastation, but then it returns to its riverbeds. I repeat, this was explained clearly by Lenin, and this is how we understand those excesses. But I insist, the main point was to make them understand that we were a hard nut to crack, that we are ready for anything. And that was a quote from Chairman Gonzalo. And I can see someone in chat wrote, hatred of indigenous people. and I'm going to take that claim immediately. Basically, like, it's wrong to say that the PCP hated indigenous people and that they tried to commit a genocide against indigenous people, because that is the same as claiming that the Vietnamese fighters tried to commit a genocide against the Vietnamese. The fact of the matter is that the majority of the People's Guerrilla Army and the PCP members were from an indigenous background, from a peasant background. And to talk about them hating indigenous people and trying to commit a genocide against indigenous people is practically fucking nonsense, because a people's group can't really commit genocide against itself. And also the fact that, like, killing a certain group isn't inherently bad, because we have to look into the fact that, like, there's reactionaries, centrists, and revolutionaries in any group, in any social group.
I think you mean
including the proletariat.
I think you mean killing people of any particular group rather than killing a particular group.
Yeah. Like, when it comes to, like, killing any particular group, it's like it's not that we're targeting the group. It's targeting like the fucking reactionaries in that group. It's not like we can't condemn the killing of reactionaries, but we can condemn the killing of, like, the group in general. Like, if the PCP exclusively targeted homosexuals, such as, like, the MRTA did, which was another guerrilla group active around the same time, who were revisionists, and they actively targeted homosexuals and killed homosexuals for the sake of being homosexuals, whereas the PCP targeted reactionary homosexuals who collaborated with the state and were acted as snitches towards the military and police, because they were often common in brothels and bars where the police would frequent. Yeah, that's pretty much it on Lukunamarka, and, like, a comment a bit on, like, generally understanding some of the so-called atrocities committed by the PCP.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that. Yeah, my understanding of the boiling situation is that there is an accusation that comes from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, excuse me, that they threw at some point, it's just an accusation. Again, you don't know whether this is true or not, but the accusation is that they threw boiling water on, I believe it was teenagers. I know there was an issue of an accusation that they killed a pregnant woman, and then there's also an issue of they threw boiling water on some teenagers. And it seems to me like teenagers became kids became babies, and then, just it kind of unravels into that what we hear there. So that seems to be my understanding of it, and how that situation. Let me just check the rest of the
exactly.
Question.
Also, like, the fact that, like, teenagers is such a vague term, because they could mean, like, 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, 17-year-olds. Anybody from 13 to, like, 19 is considered a teenager in most countries. And also the very real fact is that, like, yeah, like, fucking 18-year-olds and 17-year-olds can still be fascist militiamen and take up arms against the party. Like, the main reason for this attack on Lukunamarka was because of the so-called ronderos, which were reactionary peasant militias formed in support of the Peruvian state that hunted down communists and killed any national democrats and such. And, like, it just, like, it's so stupid to say, like, oh, they just killed peasantry. No, like, it's so stupid to expect that every peasant ever is gonna be a progressive person. Like, of course they're not. There's peasants who are reactionaries, there's peasants who are fascists, and these people organized and tried to kill members of the PCP. And in fact, that's what Lukunamarka was a response to. There was a member of the Communist Party who was killed by these reactionary peasants who lived in Lukunamarka after trying to organize them. And the action in Lukunamarka was done as retribution for the killing of this party member.
Olegario Kuritame or something like that. I can't really pronounce the name. Obviously, I'm pretty bad at pronouncing these names. I
Mm.
believe he was a commander in the organization, but it wasn't just like a killing. Like they just like attacked him. They took him to the town square. They stoned him. They stabbed him. They set him on fire, and then they shot him. So like it was an extremely,
Yeah, yeah,
it
exactly.
was a really brutal way of dealing with him. And so anytime these kinds of really horrific incidents occur, there's usually a reason why they occur. It's a response to something else happened. There's an incredibly violent backdrop, you know, which is very very difficult for us to like understand if you kind of come like from an imperialist core kind of first worlds cushy cozy kind of background where these things like don't happen. There is an incredibly violent backdrop there. There's just an
Mm.
incredible amount of violence in the context there of Peru at that time, and still, you know, to this day, and all over the world in many different places, you have this kind of violence. And we have the same thing to a different degree, I suppose, in Ireland as well. Like whenever it comes to talking about like the Irish Republican Army and that, and people will just go straight away to calling them terrorists, condemning the Irish Republican Army and everything that happened. And you know, you really need to put it in the context of what had happened, what was ongoing, and the attacks on the people, you know, the indigenous people on the land, and you know, putting that in a historical context will give you a very different perspective on what actually happened. So I think if you look at something like Lucano Marca without any kind of context, it just seems like this really unbelievable. Okay, it might still seem like an unbelievable and horrific thing, even if you do have the context, but you'll understand it a little bit more if you do at least look at the, what can we say, the precedent for it, what happened beforehand. You know, why was there such violence? You know, why was that in the uh, popular consciousness at the time? You know, it was something. I think, you know, we need to be quite clear. This, what they, you know, what they would call revolutionary violence is something that the PCP talked about a lot. You know, and that comes from, again, can't pronounce the name, Mario Tegwe, however you pronounce the name. That's something that you know, he really highlighted. If you look again, if you look at the kind of context, a larger context of the world at this time, you're looking at the sort of dying communist movement, the dying socialist movement. You've got peaceful coexistence everywhere. You know, you can see this as partially as like as a backlash to that, as a response to that. But there is a context even in Peru. You know, your man Mario Tegui has said that revolution is unfortunately not made with fastings. Revolutionaries from all parts of the world must choose between being the victims of violence or using it. You know, so those are the kinds of slogans that they've got to run with. If the revolution demands violence, authority, discipline, I'm all for violence, authority, discipline. I accept them in block form with all their horrors, without any cowardly reserves. So that's Mary Tegui, and very much a person who the party would draw inspiration from. And so yeah, I don't know that this shouldn't be seen as like exoneration or anything like that, but it should be just some sort of context to help people, you know,
Yeah, yeah.
put it in context and help people to understand
Mm.
where this is all coming from and how this kind of happened, you know.
Yeah, because like a lot of times people look at things outside of the context and scrutinize the PCP to such a abnormal level. Like nobody, you'll see people on Twitter who are so-called Marxist-Leninists who will 1 minute uh, talk about the Holodomor and talk about how it was fake, how it's bourgeois propaganda, how it's a lie, and how it's a fascist myth and such. But then you'll see these same people take up shit that the Truth and the Reconciliation Commission says about the PCP and talk about it as if it's facts, as if suddenly critical thinking isn't important, as if suddenly anything said about your political enemies is completely correct. Because this is what these people look at the PCP as. They look at the PCP as a political enemy, not as communists struggling for national liberation and new democracy, but as an enemy that must be condemned and all kinds of shit made up about it. Because, you know, why would they care about the truth when it comes to the PCP when they already decided that they aren't on the same side as the PCP?
Mm.
Instead, they are serving the Peruvian state and the conspiracy made up by the CIA to undermine the People's War in Peru. And this is a fact. The fact that these people choose to take the side of reaction and instead of taking the side of revolution. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. There's a couple of interesting comments from Syndicalist. IRA bombs cars, no one bats an eye. PCP peasant guerrilla kills reactionary peasants. Everyone goes nuts. And then there's the comment: when our turn comes, we shall not make excuses for the terror, from Karl Marx. And everybody loves that stuff, you know. Everybody goes crazy for that. Everybody's defending the Red Terror. Everybody's, you know, fighting back against a lot of more stuff. Everybody's, you know, really pushing back against that. But then the stuff gets a little bit closer to home. It gets a little bit more relevant. The closer to us in time and space it gets, the more of a backlash we see from people. And understandably, I mean, these things can often sound fine in the abstract. You know, going to war sounds fine in the abstract, but you know, when it's on your front door, maybe it doesn't seem so nice. You know, so maybe that's something of what we're seeing
I
when it
have
comes to these
a
things.
PCP. This is from the document known as "Develop the People's War: Serving the World Revolution," and in this document, there's a chapter called "On the Counter-Revolutionary War," which also has a sub-chapter, like a subsection, called "Masses Against Masses," which talks about this Peruvian state's tactic of using masses against other masses. And it talks here about, I'll read out this quote. These coerced people, drafted from among the masses, acted as guards, arrested and murdered guerrillas, carried out raising operations against neighborhood committees, or towns and even more distant ones, and took part in search and pursuit operations against the guerrillas. Later, these people were regrouped, along with people from neighboring areas, into strategic hamlets under direct military rule. And this is talking, of course, about the ronderos. And you can actually look at the Wikipedia article for ronderos. It's pretty good. It's not filled with like any romanticization of them. And it talks about like how they developed and how the state actually implemented certain like laws and stuff that like legalized the ronderos and like made them an actual part of the military. So instead of just looking at the ronderos in the context of being like independent peasant militias, we have to look at them as a integral part of the Peruvian state's action against the People's War, and the fact that these people were actually trained by the reactionary military, and they were supported by the Peruvian state against the communists.
Mm, mm. Yeah, it is a very strange thing that people don't really seem to want to point blame at the Peruvian state when it comes to any of these kind of situations. They don't really want to talk about the horrors and terrors that were inflicted upon the people. They just want to blame the PCP the whole time, and unfortunately, this is a very undialectical way of looking at the situation. And I wish people would. I mean, the numbers appear to be all wrong. I saw an interesting article quite recently, just from 2019, which came out and actually corrected the numbers from that Truth and Reconciliation Commission when it comes to like the death toll of the whole conflict. I don't think it's the whole conflict. I think it's the conflict between sort of mostly between like the start of the 80s and up to the early 90s, and I think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission statistics estimated that there were approximately 69,000 total killings, right? 30% of them, according to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, 30% of them were carried out by the state and 46% by the PCP. This would make the PCP obviously the primary offender. But, and I'll put a little link to this in the chat here so people can check this out in their own time. A study came out in 2019, which basically showed that these numbers were incorrect. This is from a guy called Silvio Rendon, an academic, who says that a direct estimation, strictly stratified both by geography and perpetrator, extended by a multiple imputation of missing perpetrator data, sets the estimated total number of killings at around 48,000, of which 28,000 were committed by the states, 18,700 by the Shining Path, and they say Shining Path here, and 1,300 by other perpetrators. The proportion of responsibilities is thus 58.3% for the state, 38.3% for the Shining Path, and 3.4% for other perpetrators. And I think that gives a very different perspective on what happened. You know, the state committed 58.3% of the killings, rather than basically the other way. They kind of flipped it. They kind of flip it around in the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. So yeah, I think that it's just an important thing to keep in mind, that not everything that came out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is, 100% reliable, 100% accurate, and we always got to be careful with what we take from these bourgeois sources, from these fascist state forces in many cases. We just need to be careful with how we approach these kinds of questions. This doesn't, by the way, exonerate anything or anyone. It's still, you can still look at the numbers and say, okay, 28,000 were killed by the state, 18,700 were killed by the Shining Path. You can still be critical of that, but at least if you're going to be critical of the actual numbers, be critical of what actually happened, rather than what the propaganda is trying to give us, if that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's probably the worst part of the entire conversation. I think.
Yeah.
I think
it's always such a headache to talk about this with people.
Yeah.
Especially because like most people who bring this up aren't people who are actually interested in learning more. They mostly are like people who want to bring it up as a gotcha argument. Like,
yeah,
it's the same as talking to like liberals who bring up, oh, what about those 60 million people who starved in Maoist China? Got you. And it's like, okay, what the fuck am I supposed to say? I can't bring out like 10 academic studies out of my ass in the middle of the street, to like prove that this person is wrong. Instead, it's just like it's basically not even worth talking to this person. Instead, what's much more productive is like, if someone is genuinely interested in learning about Maoism and they come to you and ask, hey, I've been hearing stuff about like Lukinamarka. Can you kind of explain what happened? Like, I've heard this and this, and like genuinely come to me in like a good faith way and ask to learn more about this, then it's worth talking about it. But like, if it's somebody who's just like, I'm gonna prove that you're wrong and that you're evil and you're devil worshipping commie, and like, it's just not worth it,
Yeah, definitely. You don't need to engage with bad faith actors. It's not really worthwhile. There are, I mean, look, with every communist experiment, with every socialist experiment, there's always positive aspects, there's always negative aspects. And all I would argue is that we should be fair. We should try to be as critical of all these communist movements across the board. As you said, you pointed very much so to Vietnam earlier on as well. And, you pointed out that there were... what some people would call, what bourgeois sources would say, such and such as a massacre, like a Hue massacre or something like this, and they will say that that's horrific. But all of us on the left are like, we all uphold the Vietnamese struggle. We all uphold them, We're not incredibly critical. We're not unduly critical of these things. We understand that in revolutionary situations there are bad things happen. A lot of really, really bad things happen. Revolution is not a dinner party, as they say. We don't apply that same level of understanding and nuance that we apply to Vietnam, that we apply to the Bolsheviks, that we apply to what happened in China. We often don't apply that to what happened with the PCP. And if we want to be super critical of the PCP for the actions of violence that occurred there, then we're going to need to be just as critical of all of the other socialist experiments in that way, So yeah, that's what I would say. I just think it's really important that people do understand what they're doing here. People understand, as you said earlier on, a lot of the time this comes from an ideological perspective, where it's people sort of saying, well, they're evil Maoists. We don't want to engage with them. But the people in Vietnam were just based MLs, so we like them, and so we'll be nice to them. And also the Irish Republicans, we like them, so we're just gonna gloss over the accusations of terrorism and this and that and the other from other sources. We're just gonna let that happen because they're our guys, and we'll kind of let it go. So yeah, that's all I'd say. Just treat it the same way you treat any other movement, and try to come to a more level-headed analysis based on that. So that's my little bit there. All right.
I'm just gonna say, like, we're writing down these questions because a lot of people are repeating the same question that they've sent earlier. Your questions are being written like usual in like a Google Doc that me and Paul are sharing, and we're gonna come to them. Like we just have a few other questions to go through before some of these questions get brought up.
Yeah, sure. Actually, I see there's one question that's been asked by Cornelius there. Let me just write that down in the Google Doc here. And we'll come to that in time. Okay, let's push forward because we've been talking for like 45 minutes already. Let's take let's look at the other side of things. And we've looked at the negatives there. We've looked at some of the bad things there.
Yeah.
What are the main lessons that communists around the world can learn from the experience of the PCP?
Well, I would definitely say Maoism, because I attribute Maoism to Chairman Gonzalo and the Communist Party of Peru, and that it was synthesized through their struggle, along with other struggles, obviously, but they were the ones that sort of really put Maoism into words and made it into a scientific definition. Because before that, you had Mao Zedong thought floating around, and like people calling it universal, but also like it not being very clear as to what they mean. Because some people said, oh, well, Mao Zedong thought it's universal, and by Mao Zedong thought we mean this, this, and this. And some other people will say, oh, no, well, we mean this, this, and that. Instead of like there being a concrete definition of what Mao Zedong thought was and what universal aspects of it people upheld. And the PCP came in and they were like, okay, we need to end this bullshit. We're scientific socialists. We need to have scientific definitions of things. And that's where the document on Marxism, Leninism, Maoism comes in, where they define all of the like contributions from Chairman Mao to Maoism. So that's definitely a great contribution from them. As for concrete things that came from Peru, I would say the militarization of the Communist Party is a great contribution from there. Realizing that the Communist Party shouldn't just act in the same way as any bourgeois political party should act, but it needs to be a militarized unit that is ready to commit to revolution. And like this means obviously being trained in arms and being always extremely disciplined, and like at the same time as they apply democratic centralism. This isn't a negation of democratic centralism, it's just taking democratic centralism even more seriously and remaining disciplined. Like you can't have someone who claims they adhere to democratic centralism and then like doing it in like a slack way. Like they might say, okay, fine, I'll uphold the party program even if I disagree with this and that, and then they'll only uphold it like on the surface level. They won't like go through with it fully, you know. And militarization kind of fixes that because it makes everyone disciplined. Like even if I disagree with this part of the program, the majority of the party voted for this, therefore I must uphold it fully and I must defend it with my life, you know. Another great contribution is what they call concentric construction, which essentially means that the party, army, and the United Front, the People's Army, I mean, all need to be constructed simultaneously, sort of. Because like the party can't exist without being connected to the masses, and the party can't start a revolution without being prepared for one, without a people's army. And these all form in like embryo organizations for a communist party. There's obviously like pre-party formations. A great example would be like the what's it called? Like the PCP itself had the Communist Party of Peru Red Fraction, which was a pre-party formation. Or in the United States, there is, as some comrades know, the Committee to Reconstitute the Communist Party of the United States. And in other countries, there are similar committees to reconstitute to the Communist Party. Here in Sweden, we, for example, have the Communist League, as they call themselves, who are also working towards the reconstitution of the Communist Party of Sweden. And at the same time, these organizations build united fronts and also like attempt to like militarize and like have better discipline and such throughout this period. But it's obviously very hard when you don't have access to arms as like you have in the United States, for example. So there has to be like a creative application of all of these things. And some people would even argue that a contribution from the PCP is the universality of People's War. I kind of disagree with this. I think the PCP obviously did contribute to this. However, the idea itself mainly comes from Mao, even if he never explicitly said that the People's War is universal, which isn't really a problem because like he never explicitly said that cultural revolution is universal either. And yet people are quick to take up cultural revolution but still remain critical to People's War, almost because People's War has to come first and then cultural revolution can become a thing. Like they would gladly accept this thing that's far off in the future but they won't accept something that like can actually be done in the here and now, you know?
It's like the opposite of what we were talking about earlier on, like where things that are far off in the past or far away removed from you are great. We love them. Something that's far
Yeah,
off in the future, great. We love it. But something that you need to engage in quite immediately, oof,
yeah,
well, people may not like that
yeah.
very much.
Anything that actually involves like actual change, such as building for a people's war in your own country or supporting ongoing people's wars, is a bad thing. But talking about like future events and how great it's going to be under luxury gay space communism, and how great the Soviet Union was, and how great China was, and how awesome and epic and based on Red Pill, the Red Terror was, that's fine. That's something we should do, and we should all sit on Twitter all day and just talk about how great all these past experiments were, and how great it's going to be one day in the far off future when we're all dead, instead of actually trying to build something in the real world.
Hmm. Hmm.
Mm.
All right. Thank you very much. Brilliant. Did you want to take some more? Do you want to do some more Q&As now, or do you want to push forward with a few more of our questions and then just move on to and then push through the Q&As? What do you think is better?
I think we can like take up some of the questions. Like, I think we should take the questions that are about Peru
Hmm.
first, and then we can talk about all these other questions that aren't about Peru
Hmm. Okay.
at the
Yes.
end.
Okay. No problem.
Uh,
So let's take a look at some Q&As from. Yeah. This is kind of some of the questions we've asked. We've got written down in our document are going to probably cover a lot of the Q&As that I'm seeing here already. Um. Yeah, I suppose one of the questions that I see here from Matthew Calise from a little bit earlier on. There's two. There's one from Aspen and there's one from Matthew Calise. We'll take the one from Matthew first. I think this will be a useful one to ask. Can you ask Vučko, Paul? Can you ask Vučko to talk about the modern continuation of the struggle in the Peruvian People's Movement and the militarized Communist Party? And aside from that, we also have Aspen Zachariah, comrade, good to see you, who asks what your thoughts are on Movadef, Movadef. I can't remember exactly what that's an acronym for. I remember reading about this. But,
I'll explain.
Great. Okay.
I'll take the question. I'll take the question about Movada first because
Yeah.
it's a very short answer. I think they are opportunist rats who will get what's coming.
Oof.
And as to answer to what
Brutal.
Movadef stands for, Movadef stands for Movimento por Amnistia Derechos Fundamentales, which translates to Movement for Amnesty and Fundamental Rights.
Mm.
It is what I referred to earlier as the right opportunist line in Peru. They are the people who support capitulation,
Okay,
and it's made up of revisionists who were formerly members of the PCP. And essentially, the whole point of the party is to get as many people out of jail and promote a peaceful transition to socialism. And they talk about the People's War, but the People's War they mean is a non-violent version of People's War, which is essentially reformism, but with a different name.
People's chats, people's conversations.
Yeah. You know, we can just debate the landlords and big bourgeoisie
We can just
out
debate
of
them.
power.
Yeah, just debate them in the free market of ideas until communism. That's what
Debates until communism.
that's what the heads of communism are talking about. Yeah,
Exactly.
So the modern continuation of the struggle then in the Peruvian People's Movement, the militarized Communist Party. The militarized Communist Party is a different group as well, isn't it? That's like the MPCP.
Yeah, exactly.
Like that.
The MPCP aren't good people. The MPCP are the ones that often people mix up with the actual PCP.
The drug stuff, isn't it? They maybe
exactly. They're the
allegedly.
ones. They're the two brothers who are called. What the fuck were they called? Jose and Raul. I forgot their last name. Jose and Raul is basically what they're usually referred to as in documents, and they're the leaders of this so-called militarized Communist Party, which in reality is just a drug cartel trying to live off of the memory of the PCP, and it essentially like enslaves peasants in areas it takes over and makes them grow cocaine that they can then sell further. And both of these people have condemned Chairman Gonzalo and consider him to be a capitulationist, despite there not being any evidence of him capitulating. Well, at the same time, they claim to uphold the mantle of what the PCP once was, according to themselves. As for the Peruvian People's Movement, it is still active, and it publishes documents regularly. And an important thing to know about the Peruvian People's Movement is that it isn't something that's based in Peru itself. The Peruvian People's Movement was generated outside of Peru. It is a thing to secure international support for the peoples war in Peru. It actually started here in Sweden, kind of. Like a lot of the prominent people who were involved in the starting of the People's Movement of Peru lived in Sweden in political, like as political refugees and such. Yeah, some people said in the chat the Kispe brothers. I think that's how it's pronounced. They're the ones who lead this so-called militarized communist party, which in reality is nothing but a fucking drug cartel for cocaine. But yeah, that's essentially my answer. Like the MPP, which is the Spanish acronym for the Peruvian People's Movement, is very much still active and publishes declarations and such regularly.
Yeah, thank you very much. It is. I mean, this is one of the things that people hear. Like, there's often, I suppose, maybe a misconception that as soon as Gonzalo was locked up, that was it. That was the end of the People's War. Things just ended. This is kind of like a recurring thing. It ended then, and then it was sort of, it was waning then, and then it was waning into 2000s, and it's waning into 2010s, and it's now waning in the 2020s. It seems to be there is kind of a narrative that just around the corner is the end of the PCP, but then there keeps on continuing elements who keep on going. I mean, there's that great interview with Conrad Laura from 2012, very interesting. I don't know recently if there's been that much, but to my knowledge there does still seem to be some. They still have been planning activities even for this year, even planning stuff for this year. I'm not sure if they went ahead or not. I'm not, it's difficult to find information about them, but it seems like they're still working towards continuing the PPW.
Somebody in chat just said, please condemn Winston. I'm just gonna say I'm not gonna engage in any attacks on certain individuals during the stream. I will be only correcting mistaken lines, but individuals, I think, don't have to be addressed in this stream. Maybe in some future shit talk stream where we both get pissed and are drunk and shit talk anybody who we don't like. Maybe that day might come, but today I won't be addressing any specific individuals and what lines they hold on the PCP, no matter how fallacious they are. Which is just to answer that quick chat thing.
That settles that, I suppose.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Vučko. Great stuff. Let's take a look here at the next question that we had written down, then we'll return to some Q&As afterwards. What are some common misconceptions? What are some common misconceptions about the PCP that you think need to be cleared up?
Well, we addressed some of them. I talked a bit about how they are accused of being homophobic, which is untrue, because this is something that comes from the reactionary state. The PCP did kill homosexuals, but they didn't kill these homosexuals because they were homosexual. They killed them because they were police informants and collaborated with the state, and they were snitches.
Yeah, it was more just that they killed individuals who happened to be, LGBTQ plus, rather than targeting groups, which is an important distinction.
Yeah. Along with this claim, there's also the claim that they killed prostitutes and sex workers, which is also true. They killed sex workers and prostitutes because they were snitches and police informants, because the police in Peruvian cities would visit bars and brothels, which often had homosexual elements, and they had prostitutes, obviously, if it's a brothel, and they would pay them extra money to tell them about rumors and what they heard and what they know about PCP activity in the local area. And then when the PCP takes over this area and they find out that this person told the state about this and it resulted in somebody in the party getting killed or somebody in the army getting killed, they would have the retribution. And this is the correct course of to take. If somebody snitches on the party or on the People's Army, they deserve what's coming. They're just a member of they're an instrument of the reactionary state, despite like whatever group they are part of otherwise. It doesn't really matter. It's just moralization to say, oh, it's inherently wrong to kill a homosexual out of the virtue of them being homosexual, which isn't true. It isn't inherently wrong, because a homosexual can just as much be a reactionary, a centrist, or a revolutionary as any other person in society, because it is class that we must look at, and not somebody's sexuality, gender, occupation, etc., etc.
Hmm. Okay, thank you very much. And
there's also I forgot the main one, which is the main accusation is the one that like the PCP was genocidal and tried to kill these indigenous people, which I addressed earlier. It's just simply not true, because the PCP again was mostly made up of indigenous people and peasants, meaning that like a group can't really commit genocide against itself, and the fact that they like killed people, the major population in the country was indigenous and peasantry, and the fact that they had to fight these people shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. And the accusation of it being genocide, quote unquote, is silly, because then Mao and the Communist Party of China also committed genocide against Chinese people during the Civil War, and the same thing with the Russians during the Russian Revolution. They also committed genocide against Russians because they killed a bunch of Russian people, and the same thing with the Vietnamese or any other revolution that like, because revolution is civil war, but this is something that Lenin teaches us already. We can't really just like ignore the fact that like, oh, people of the same nationality are going to kill each other. It's just like, yeah, of course they are.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's push on to a few more Q&As now. We've got quite a few taken down here, so it'd be good if we can move through them. I think you'll probably be able to answer this one pretty quickly. Just another one on Peru. Syndicalists asks Paul Vučko, what are your thoughts on the PCP's blood debts of the people? And I know that some person also mentioned in the live chat that this was actually a mistranslation. Did you want to talk about this idea of blood debts?
I've actually never heard of this, to be honest. Like, this is something that I'm hearing for like, I've only heard it like a few times, like this thing about blood debts, but like nobody I've actually talked to about the PCP or anything that I've read from the PCP actually like mentions and explains what this is. I think it just comes from like the comrade said, like somebody in the chat said that this just comes from a mistranslation. Because oftentimes the documents by the Communist Party of Peru weren't translated by them or with their supervision, but they were translated by like people who speak Spanish but live in like other countries, and like the way that the Communist Party of Peru writes is very specific to like the regions of Peru where they were active, because they also wrote stuff in like the native languages of the indigenous people, like Quechua, and like sometimes like they use symbolism and like idioms and like all of that stuff that's inherent to those languages, which seems strange to us who speak English or other languages. And like it's like, okay, we can't really like judge a different language for the way it has norms and like stuff that they say that's just like part of that language, you know. For example, here in Sweden we have like I can't think of an example, but we have a bunch of like silly stupid shit that we say.
Oh, don't.
That if you translate it to English,
it's really, really offensive. I think I know the ones you're talking about.
Yeah, like
don't don't say them.
I'm not gonna say it. I'm not gonna say that. And like if I translated them to English, it would be super stupid and silly. But like when you say them in Swedish, they make sense. Because that's what they were like in the language, you know.
Yeah. So that again, context. Got to get the context, you know. Really, really important that we understand the context this is all coming from. Yeah, there's a lot of that as well. I think people also as well, they get really on this Hefe Torah thing. They get really into Hefe Torah and great leadership, and this is one of the other big things. If I'm not mistaken, Hefe Torah doesn't mean great leadership. That actually, even just that word Hefe Torah just means leadership. You know, just in and of itself, leadership. So
yeah, exactly. It's the English translation is usually translated to as great leadership. And in the interview, for with Chairman Gonzalo, he actually talks a little bit about this. He says, in our party, Revolution and People's War, the proletariat, by the combination of necessity and historical chance, has brought forth a group of leaders. In Engels' view, it is a necessity that generates leaders and a top leader, but just who that is determined by chance, by a set of specific conditions that come together at a particular place and time. In this way, in our case too, a great leadership, jefatura, has been generated. This was the first acknowledged in the party at the expanded National Conference of 1979. But this question involves another basic question that cannot be overlooked and needs to be emphasized. There is no great leadership, jefatura, that does not base itself on a body of thought, no matter what its level of development may be. The reason that a person has come to speak as the leader of the party and the revolution, as the resolution state, has to do with the necessity and historical chance, and obviously with Gonzalo thought. None of us knows what the revolution and the party will call on us to do. And when the specific task arises, the only thing to do is assume the responsibility. Which is clearly like, this is what he explains, that it naturally arose, that this is something that arises in revolutions, and this comes from Lenin and Engels, and like really any revolution has had this thing come up. We can even look at the Philippine Revolution and the way they look up to Jose Maria Sison. Even though they don't admit that they have a jefatura, it very much looks like a jefatura, the same way the one in Peru is, or for example, the comrades in Turkey who uphold Ibrahim Kaipakaya, or how the Indian comrades uphold Charu Mazumdar, or how the Russians upheld Lenin and Stalin, or how the Chinese upheld Mao, or any revolution really just upholds its leaders because these leaders are naturally and organically generated through the revolution. And they take up this role, which only comes with responsibility. It doesn't really come with any like specific privilege. It's just a responsibility that they take up to be seen as the leader of the party, you know?
See, this is the thing again, where it just strikes me as incredibly inconsistent, where people are unduly critical and harsh on the experience of the Peruvian struggle. If they applied that same level of scrutiny against, you know, what they call, you know, the cult of personality, all this sort of stuff, if they took that same approach and were just as hard on, you know, China or the Russian experience, whatever, like they'd throw away the five heads, you know, they'd throw away all of them, you know. But people are just extremely hard on the Peruvian experience, and if you have a problem with even the five heads of communism, even the five, never mind the sixth, you know, if you have a problem with that, then okay, that's one thing. But I think it's better that people are at least consistent and realize that oftentimes people are applying a really unfair and undue level of scrutiny to the Peruvian experience that is just maybe it's kind of ridiculous, you know?
Yeah, because like if somebody is critical at all of the concept of like venerating individuals, which I can fully understand from a communist perspective, why would you want like to look up at Mao or Marx or Engels or anybody? I kind of understand that, even if I personally disagree with it and think that individuals do play a role in history, obviously not as much as the masses and the question of class struggle does. But people and individuals still play a role in history, and we can't be completely like unscientific and say, oh no, it's only class struggle, or it's only this or that plays any kind of role in history. Because like it's like, you know, it's not really true. You can't look at things mechanically. You have to look at them dialectically, and you have to look at the role individuals play, the masses play, each class plays, each strata plays, each party plays, each, you know, just all of these different factors. You can't really just say, oh, it's only this one thing that matters. You have to look at the whole thing in its totality, you know?
Yeah, that's right. And I think that that's something that people will tacitly kind of themselves maybe feel or know, but they don't really want to admit it. Like all the time you have people sort of saying, in Ireland all the time, people are like, "Oh, if only James Connolly survived, everything would be okay." We'd
Yeah,
have our 32 county socialist republic. Um,
which obviously isn't true. Like
yeah,
if everybody who participated in the Easter Rising, except James Connolly, got massacred, I promise that the Easter Rising would have still failed. You know?
yeah, yeah. We wouldn't be living in full communism,
No.
unfortunately. Yeah. Again, this is just it. I would just encourage people to be a lot more consistent in their critiques, and if they want to have those critiques, as you said, if they want to have critiques of venerating individuals, then okay, then that's fine. But apply that across the board rather than just targeting organizations who maybe you don't think are your team or something like that. Because, well, and also they probably are your team. I mean, this is the international proletarian struggle, for communism. So yeah, that's a
Unless these people actually don't take the side of the proletariat.
yeah. Unless these people are actual like full on reactionaries, then
Yeah.
then I don't know what they're doing here. Yeah. Okay. Cool. So let's take a look at a few more questions, and here's an
Yeah.
interesting one. Quite a contemporary one now. We'll be getting slightly into some slightly different terrain now. The Anglesist asked, Vučko, how do you view the current pink wave in South America? Do you view it as good or bad for the left? The pink wave, I think pink wave was mostly 2000s. There seems to be maybe a slight resurgence now. I know people are very excited as well, even in Peru and stuff like that. I know there's a lot of excitement. You see the pencils everywhere. People are.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on this?
I'm I'm not really like positive or negative to it because I don't really see that it matters that much because like first of all I'll explain what the pink wave is. It's basically like the election of like social democrats and so-called quote unquote democratic socialists in Latin American countries, for example Maduro in Venezuela, Morales in Bolivia, possibly Castillo in Peru, and like some guy in Argentina who was elected a few years ago.
Mm.
I forget his name, but yeah, he was also elected there, and he's also a dem sock demi kind of guy. And essentially, I don't view that this matters a lot. It just sort of shows that a lot of these countries are moving towards working with Chinese social imperialism more, such as in the case of Venezuela and Bolivia, who have given China mineral rights and other rights to oil and such, which they don't give to the US, for example. And also the fact that generally to uphold a semi-colonial and semi-feudal system, it is much more functional to give the people some benefits, such as building up a welfare state. And this is comparable to how capitalist imperialist countries in the global north do it. And they also build up welfare states to preserve capitalism the same way these countries do to preserve semi-colonialism and bureaucratic capitalism. So really, there isn't whether it's good or bad. It's just something that exists and that communists must learn how to work against. Especially in the case of Peru, I don't think it's even going to happen. Like Castillo, the guy who leads the Peru Libre party, who has claimed to be a Marxist-Leninist and a Mariategist, he is getting slandered so much by the media and being called, a communist and a Sendero sympathizer and a terrorist and such. And I think that, like, in typical Peruvian fashion, I think he's going to get impeached, even if he even gets elected pretty soon, like after the election. This also answered the question that Matthew Calise asked. Can you guys talk about the conditions of Peru today with Peru Libre and likely election winner Castillo claiming to be a Marxist-Leninist Mariategist? I don't think he's a Marxist-Leninist or a Mariategist. I think he's just a regular old democratic socialist reformist type who would like to see Peru much more closely work with Chinese social imperialism rather than U.S. imperialism.
You've always got to raise an eyebrow. Anytime you see someone saying Marxist, comma, Leninist, comma, and then when they don't put in like the little hyphen, when they put in the comma.
Yeah.
You know, when an organization calls itself Marxist and Leninist, you got to raise an eyebrow. You're like,
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? So, yeah, maybe not. maybe not the based ML that
Yeah.
may appear at
He
first.
also has a quote from him where he says, "Soy rondero." Yeah, the legendary duck in chat brought this up. That he was a rondero, like he was part of this reactionary militia
Oh wow,
that
Jesus.
fought against the PCP.
Right. Okay.
So it's like, yeah, sure, this guy who was part of this fascist militia is totally epic based, productive forces, critical support guy.
Based point man. What the fuck? Okay. Yeah, I didn't know he was a former Rondero, but that's well,
Yeah.
the more you know. All right. Well, that's bleak. That's bleak.
Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose the one progressive aspect, the one positive aspect of like the pink wave is that you can actually show people that like electing these social democrats doesn't really improve the situation greatly for people. It can be a way of exposing. It's a way you can expose social democracy for the sham that it is. So that's the only positive aspect that can possibly come out of that I can think of.
Yeah.
All right, so here is another question about PCP, with the PCP, and here's one. This is an interesting one. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. This is from Harry Blackburn. Paul, could you ask Vučko about what he thinks a Peru ran by Chairman Gonzalo and the PCP? It says PCP-SL, but just PCP would look like. Let's get idealists. Let's have some fun here. let's say they won. It's the mid-90s. They're past strategic equilibrium. They've moved into the strategic offensive. We're just about achieving new democracy. How's it look?
Well, we actually have like a look into this kind of like we can look at the way the people's committees in Peru functioned, and these committees would probably remain open during the period of new democracy, as well as the PCP actually outlines in some documents. I don't remember which ones exactly. The main tasks of like what needs to be done in Peru. However, what we would most likely see is something similar as to what happened in China, like a sort of great leap forward, where they like rebuild the country and stuff, and also the beginnings of like a cultural revolution forming in order to secure the revolution and such, as well as we would see an effort to increase literacy and such, and like protect the country and like build up militarily and such. However, yeah, I think that's what would happen most likely, like what we usually see with socialist countries popping up, a period of building up, consolidating the revolution, and making life better for people generally. And yeah, I think that's what would happen. I think we would see like what happened in China, but done much more efficiently, which without the missteps that might have happened during the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, because we learn from those lessons, obviously. However, there will obviously be new challenges for the comrades in Peru and such. And those can only be overcome, and we can only find out what those are when the PCP actually wins political power in Peru.
Okay, thank you very much. Not an easy question. I appreciate you having a go with it. Here's an interesting one, maybe kind of going in a different direction. Actually, I didn't take down the name of the person who asked this question, so you can take credit for that in the live chat if you want. But someone asked, can you ask Vučko what are general criticisms that modern Marxist-Leninist Maoists, principally Maoists, have about Chairman Gonzalo and the PCP? So did you want to touch on any criticisms, fair or principled criticisms, that should be leveled in the direction of the Peruvian experience?
I mean, like, there's nothing really that's like ideological criticism. Like, we can criticize like individual actions and stuff that happened. For example, the excesses in Lucanamarca. Like, everybody's in agreement, including the PCP themselves, that these were a negative aspect, and that we need to learn from that. But like ideological wise, there's no real like criticism that I know of that I can offer up, or that like has been presented by other Maoists, other than, for example, like maybe like how come the revisionists managed to do a coup in the 2000s after the capture of Chairman Gonzalo, when the People's War still was at its height, you know.
Mm.
But the problem with like trying to criticize the PCP, because of like things that happened, is that like we can't really do that because, as Chairman Mao tells us, no investigation, no right to speak. And the thing is, we can't really investigate these situations because like there's so much misinformation and like so much that's unclear, and the party obviously hasn't published any clear documents, because this would be devastating for them to like tell the enemy what's going on, you know, internally.
Mm.
So like there's a lot of that stuff that's like unclear of what happened, why it happened, and like we just have to wait until we have more knowledge before we can actually make an assessment of the Peruvian Revolution. And I think the first people who will make an assessment of the mistakes will probably be the Communist Party of Peru themselves, you know, not people from outside. I think the PCP is very much capable of evaluation, self-criticism, and criticism of what has happened, you know.
Yeah, there's one thing Maoists do, it's engage in crit and self-crit endlessly.
Yeah.
You know. All right, thank you very much. Let's take a look at some other questions that we had here. It's from Agent 58. Was asked earlier on. Paul, ask Vučko, what is Vučko's opinion on Partija Rada, Serbian ML anti-revisionist party of Labour? I would be very interested in his opinion as someone who lives in Serbia. I think you said you lived in Sweden earlier on.
I'm not sure if he means that I live in Serbia or that he lives in Serbia, or that they live in Serbia.
Yeah, I'm not.
But
sure. Do you have any thoughts?
As for my opinion on Partija Rada, I think they're a primarily progressive force, even if I have some major ideological disagreements with them. For example, the fact that they aren't a Maoist organization, rather than that they just call themselves sort of anti-revisionist ML, which is my main criticism of them, obviously. But like, they have a correct position on a lot of things, and like they did a interview with the Connolly Youth Movement, which was a very funny interview in my opinion, because the Connolly Youth Movement asked them, what are your opinions on China? and then Partija Rada just went, oh, China is a social imperialist country, and anybody who actually upholds China is an idiot who doesn't know anything.
I'm not gonna say anything.
All over the...
Yeah, they really went for it, and yeah, I'm not gonna say anything. I'm not gonna say anything on that one. But yeah, it was an interesting moment in the CYM.
Yeah.
People are reading between the lines at the moment.
Yeah.
All right. Stop reading between the lines, guys. Let's get back to it.
Yeah.
All right. Here's one now. Speaking of China, it's from Space Marks with an X. Super cool. Paul, what do you think about China not supporting the CPP and CPI Maoists, knowing they're the last, quote, socialist superpower? Socialist and super. Big scare quotes there. What are your thoughts about this, Vučko? Why would the socialist behemoths of the world, China, not uphold comrades in the CPP and CPI Maoist? What's going on?
Well, you see, Paul, it's obviously because of material conditions and the fact that, like, you know, they don't want to turn. Yeah, they need to develop the productive forces in China first before they can actually support world revolution.
Base Daddy Xi Jinping point, man. Yeah.
And they also have to, like, you know, make sure that, like, the imperialist countries don't have a reason to invade them, which is why they don't support No, I'm joking, obviously. The reason why China doesn't support these movements is because China is a social imperialist country that has very much an interest in preserving semi-colonialism in as many countries as possible, because that way they can plunder these countries. Because if actual new democracy rose up in these countries, suddenly all these resources in India and all this nice water in the Philippines would be out of their reach, because if they attack another socialist country, their entire illusion of being socialist would fall apart. And that's just a fact. Like, you know, China supported the monarchists in the Nepalese People's War.
Yeah.
China currently supports Duterte in the Philippines against the New People's Army. China currently sells material and stuff to the Modi government, which is then used to make weapons to shoot at Maoists in India. China today plays a counter-revolutionary role in the same way the United States or any other imperialist power does. And to deny this is to deny basic facts. Yeah, that's pretty much what I have to say on that.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Even when I was at my most pro-China, I was always like, "Hey, what's going on? Why are you guys giving all these free guns to Duterte in the Philippines? What's going on here? Why are you doing that? Why aren't you supporting the communist revolutionaries? What are you doing in the what they call the South China Sea? What's sometimes called the West Philippine Sea. What are you doing there? What are you doing? Have you got an eye on all that oil underneath? What are you doing? What are you doing with all those trees? Yeah, what are you doing with all those trees?
You're just
delogging the Philippines. What are you doing there, China? Even when I was super pro China, I was still, this really made me scratch my head quite a bit. So I think people should really pull those threads and maybe unravel the whole thing a little bit more, and it's kind of a weak link in the chain that can reveal the true class nature of the CPC.
I'm reading the chat and I love what Legendary Duck just said. I have a major disagreement with Peru. They didn't blow up the central bank to abolish commodity.
Oh shit. Paul Pot in the chat.
Which is obviously... Yeah, exactly.
That's gas. Okay, so thank you very much. Yeah, so I think Space Marks, the conclusion is that we don't approve. Let's just say we don't approve of China.
We don't approve.
We don't approve of China not supporting CPP and CPI most.
I mildly condemn China for not doing this.
Putting the critical support, is that what they say? No. Yeah, it is a bit of a betrayal of the people's. It's a massive betrayal of the proletarian movement. It's certainly not proletarian internationalism. I know they kind of say this thing like, oh well, we don't export revolution, this, that, and the other. But there comes a certain point where
but like neither the Soviet.
It's like there's a point where you're not supporting revolution and you're actually supporting counter revolution. You're supporting the destruction of revolution. Exactly. You're supporting fascist state forces. That's a very different situation to like being a passive observer.
Yeah.
So yeah. Anyway,
like matter. even the USSR, which is most often like accused of not supporting other struggles, supported other struggles. Like they often sent agents through the Comintern to help build the communist parties in other countries. And the same thing with the Communist Party of China during the Cultural Revolution. Like I said, Gonzalo himself was in China and got training in like making bombs and stuff in order to prepare for a revolution in other countries, and China did this, and it invited people from the third world to train them to become better communists and make revolution in their own countries. And like China today doesn't do this at all. Like China today has that stupid silly ass Communist International Conference thingy. I think it's called the International Conference of
Parties.
Yeah. It's such a stupid thing. Like there's the so-called Communist Party of Sweden is a participant there, and they're just a fucking meme here. They're like, I won't comment on them that much, but they're a headache, and like that entire thing is a headache, and like most of the parties that are involved in that are like homophobic as fuck. For example, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation.
Oh yeah, There's a lot of very reactionary views, especially on LGBTQ plus issues. There's a lot of reactionary views with many of those organizations, unfortunately. Something that needs to be really stamped down and not tolerated.
Something that I need to mention is that like it's so funny because a Dengite once accused me of like, oh, you support the PCP who are homophobes, and I was like, okay, but like you support China, and like last I checked, China still hasn't legalized like gay marriage and like stuff. So like, hey buddy, you sure? Let me just answer what Aspen Zachariah said. Isn't the Communist Party of Sweden pretty anti-immigration? The Communist Party of Sweden isn't. However, the organization known as the Communist Party just has made some strange comments. I wouldn't say that they're anti-immigration, especially recently when some very rightist elements left the party. So I wouldn't say that they are anti-immigration. However, they have had a bit of problems with people who are very Strasserite-ish in nature. But most of those people have like split and are starting their own like anti-immigration, quote-unquote, leftist organizations. But yeah, there's a difference. Here in Sweden, we have two organizations, one who calls themselves the Communist Party of Sweden, and one that calls itself just the Communist Party. And they're both different types of revisionists. One of them has its origins in the 70s, and the other one has its origins back in like the 80s. One of them is originally like a deviation of Mao Zedong thought, like one that was like ultra left and like that was like ultra left and like had an incorrect line when it came to trade unions. And the other one, which was the Communist Party of Sweden, has its origins in being a Brezhnevite split from the modern Demsoc party, which is known as the Left Party. Yeah, that's a brief overview on that, just to answer that question briefly.
Okay, thank you, Vučko. Great stuff. Here's an interesting question from P41 Pavle Milosevic. Yeah, I can't. You pronounce everything better than I do. What are the main differences? What are the main differences between the Communist Party in Peru, the Communist Party in India, I'm assuming CPI Maoist, and the Communist Party in the Philippines?
I mean, like, the main question would be probably like, the thing is with the comrades in India, in some documents, there's very much, especially from Charu Mazumdar, they mention how People's War is the only way to commit to revolution in any country. So I would say that the comrades in India sort of uphold the universality of People's War, even if they don't talk about it that much.
Yeah, that's what I believe as well. Yeah, it seems to be. They seem to have kind of like a centrist, but kind of a leaning left kind of position.
Yeah, definitely.
Within the larger.
Same with the Turkish comrades. But like, I would say that like the main differences between the PCP and the CPI Maoist is that like very minor differences in how they define Maoism. Because something we have to understand is that the international communist movement still hasn't consolidated around a single definition of Maoism, which it's currently working towards doing. Like if you look at like there's a website called Communist International. I'm gonna link to it. Wait, let me just get the correct link.
No problem.
I believe that's the thing.
You put it in the live chat?
I'm just checking what the correct. Yeah. Okay. It's CI dash IC .org. So it's like that. This is the website link. If you look at that website, you can find a lot of like documents about the current international situation and stuff.
Put a little link there.
And also, I just noticed that there's a joint international May Day declaration. Okay, I'm going to read that later.
Something to do after this.
Yeah.
Nice. Okay, very cool.
But yeah, that's a website that I recommend a lot of people have to look at and keep track of, because it updates frequently and it keeps track on like the international communist situation, you know. And it's very important for all Maoists to keep an eye on that. But yeah.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Did you want to touch on the CPP, MPA? I know that's
sorry.
As well. Maybe some differences there, because there is a little bit of a, you know, I suppose some people would often say like, you know, kind of Joma and Gonzalo as being kind of like opposite poles, you know, within the MLM movement. So did you want to talk about that a little bit? I kind of touched on, I kind of alluded to it a little bit at the start, between kind of seeing like there's kind of like a left line and a right line and stuff like that. But I'm not sure if you wanted to flesh that out a little bit more.
The main problem with the CPP is that they never really united around a clear definition of Maoism. Like, for them, oftentimes it has been that Maoism is interchangeable with Mao Zedong thought, that they aren't really two different things, but rather that Mao Zedong thought became known as Maoism, and that it was just a change in terminology rather than a qualitative leap, which has led to some ideological problems with them, such as Joma pushing for electoralism and reformism in imperialist countries, because he thinks that people's war is impossible, and that we should all go down the so-called October path, which is essentially repeating what happened in Petrograd in 1917, which doesn't really work. And that's a topic in and of itself, like the whole topic of people's war, which I don't think we should get into that now. It wouldn't be very qualitatively good to get into that. It would require a different type of stream that's much more of a sort of what MLM in practice had with the peace report, where it's like you have to stand in front of a whiteboard and explain shit. Because the question of people's war and the universality of it is a very complicated question. But like, yeah, that's the main difference as well. Like that, a lot of people in the CPP don't uphold what's it called? They don't uphold the universality of people's war, and they also don't have a very clear definition of what Maoism is. And also, up until like this year or last year, they didn't do urban guerrilla work. Like they specifically had like participation in elections and reformism and like passive struggle in the cities. Whether or not this was because of material conditions, or because they genuinely thought that in the cities you could make change through the electoral process, I'm unsure. But they have rectified this now, and they have started committing to guerrilla actions in the cities as well, which is a great development. And I fully support the people's war in the Philippines, and as well as the CPP, despite some like ideological differences that I have with them, and like criticisms that have to be made, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like the embodiment of critical support. I mean, that's the criticisms, you know, when it comes to critically supporting them, you know. So I think that's important. Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. I think that's really useful. Let's push forward now. Let's take a look here at the chat. Kabir Haider says, Paul, how do I promote class consciousness in a place where capitalism is deeply ingrained into the culture? Everywhere, all over the world, I think in most places, capitalism is deeply ingrained into the culture. Same as everywhere else, I suppose. Did you want to take that? Did you have any thoughts on that particular question?
I think we can both talk about this. I'll be very short on it, and then you can talk about it a bit. Yeah. Because you, unlike me, have actually participated in like jobs. I have sort of tried to raise class consciousness among like people in my class and stuff, but I'm very much a young person. I'm turning 19 this year. So I'm not really experienced in that field. But like what I would suggest is usually talking to people about like, hey, how is life? What do you feel and what do you think? And like, do you think that we're exploited? Why do we not have as much money and stuff? And like, it usually has to do with a lot of listening first. You have to listen to people and talk to them about their problems, because usually these problems stem from class questions. An incorrect approach would be starting to talk about Marxism and like Leninism and Maoism immediately with these people. Instead, you need to do it very slowly and with a correct approach. Oftentimes, it's much easier, especially if you find a local issue, such as that rent is getting raised in your neighborhood for everyone. That usually is a catalyst for like raising class consciousness, and it can be done in a much faster process than usual. But like usually it's kind of a slow process, you know.
It is a slow process. It's a very difficult process. It depends on where you're at and what the situation, what the material conditions of the place you're at are, and what they're like. In Ireland, for example, like the trade union movement, and in terms of like trade union organising, in terms of organising the workplace, it's very much an uphill battle, because even if you start talking to your co-workers I've been in this situation like in many different. I've worked all over. I've worked in, I spent many years working like in Domino's Pizza. I worked in McDonald's. I worked in factories. I worked in a tin whistle factory. I've worked, so I've worked all over the place. I worked in a computer shop, and then I worked as an English language teacher for many years. And there's a sense of it's very bleak because with the 1990 Industrial Relations Act in Ireland, it basically made any trade union activity and organising very, very difficult, if not impossible, to follow through with. Strikes are extremely difficult to organise. And it's very much an uphill battle. They made it as difficult as possible for people to do any kind of organising. You can't do any kind of like sympathetic strikes or solidarity strike. I forget the name for it exactly, but like solidarity strikes, where for example, if another workplace is going on strike, you'd strike in solidarity with them, and that would help build up a larger class consciousness among the people. You can't do that in Ireland. You can't do anything. So the workers' movement is totally defanged, and unfortunately, that has actually made a lot of people turn away even from working with unions and that, and it's for a lot of people, they don't even see it as being a viable path to building class consciousness, but yeah, it is a case of just talking to people everywhere you go, whether that's in the community, whether you're with tenants unions, whether it's with a communist organization, whatever it might be. You just need to get out and talk to people. Explain to them the situation, as you said, ask them questions. How do they feel about this? People feel exploited all the time, especially like if you live like in a working class area, like people feel this all the time. So if you just get into them and talk to them about some local issues, then that's how you go about it. As you said, like if there's an issue, like there's a particular landlord who's fucking around and kicking people out. Evictions is a massive thing at the moment, like in Ireland, especially with COVID and that.
Same here.
Well, people are being kicked out during a pandemic, and everybody sees how inhumane and horrific this is, to be kicking people out and to be evicting people, and it's just a really horrific and inhumane thing to do. And so you can point to that and say, well, look, what do you think of that? What are your thoughts on that? And you can organize people and instill class consciousness through doing things like that. But yeah, look, I would just say, don't try and do these things as an individual. Try to do these things as collectively as possible, where possible. Get into an organization, get into a communist organization, join your unions, whether that's workers' union, tenants' union, what have you. Get into your unions. They will train you. They will give you organizer training. They'll give you tips. They'll give you advice relevant to the material conditions within which you find yourself. Because this is the one thing that we need to do as Marxists. We need to always have a concrete analysis of a concrete situation. We can't. I'm just going to give you like vague platitudes for how to do socialism here right now. But you need to have a concrete analysis of a concrete situation, and the communist organizations in your area will have that. They'll have been engaging in a materialist analysis of the situation and looking at the best path forward. And those are the people that you need to be asking for the advice relevant to your area, to your community, and so on and so forth. So those are my thoughts.
Definitely.
All right. Thank you very much. Cornelius is here. Yeah, I'm sorry. Did you want to say anything else there?
Yeah, I was just gonna say it's a very similar situation to Sweden, actually. Like trade unionism here has taken a massive blow, especially like recently in 2018 there was a new law introduced that very much limited the amount of like opportunities to go on strike. So pretty much now it's like almost impossible to like organize a strike.
Yeah.
That is legal and approved by the trade union. Wildcat strikes still happen, of course, but they are usually they're usually brought down by the police.
Yeah.
Because they're not approved. And also the same thing with landlords and like evictions here. It has become quite a big problem here, as well as like general workers' rights questions. Like a lot of bosses have just chosen to like not give a shit about working conditions now, because we can't afford proper equipment and shit because blah blah blah, COVID, money problems, blah blah blah. And like, okay, fix it, like fuck shit, make your pay slightly less to make sure that the workers aren't living in like shit.
Yeah.
And like I would assume that it's a similar problem all across imperialist countries, because even in America we see how our comrades there are organizing tenants committees through the neighborhood defense movement and other such like working class committees. So I don't think it's something unique to Sweden and Ireland. I think that's something that we're seeing all around the world now that capitalism is going into a massive and general crisis.
Absolutely, it's spreading everywhere. So
yeah,
Yeah. International proletariat needs to get united. We need to get our shit together. All right. Cornelius Fabian Ousted Perrier says, Paul, long time, but I'm glad to be here. As a Dane, I would ask if it doesn't deviate too much subject wise, what Vučko thinks of Nordic transnationalism and Malmo Scone, I can't pronounce that. Malmo
Scania.
Scania, Danish relations.
Yeah. Scania is the English name for the region of Sweden that the karma is referring to, which is called Skåne in Swedish. But like the thing is, like Nordic transnationalism is kind of like a fantasy. Like there's no real support for like the Nordic countries uniting. I think in any of the Nordic countries. Especially like Finland, which is completely different from all of the other Nordic countries, considering they speak a completely different language. And like I haven't really seen any actual support for uniting these countries. So I'm a bit skeptical to it, and I also don't see what the point of it would be, because it's also very different to like uniting the Yugoslav countries or other oppressed nations uniting, because then there's a reason for it. But like Nordic transnationalism, like all of these countries would have independent communist movements, and especially like all three of these Scandinavian countries that are like, in this case, I'm referring to Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. All of them have independent Maoist movements, and none of these movements have talked about any kind of like national or like unity that would combine these countries into one country. So I think it's like unnecessary to talk about that. When it comes to Scania, I think that it is a part of the Swedish nation, despite all of the memes about Scania being so close to Denmark and like speaking very closely to what the Danish sounds like to Swedish people, or at least Swedish people who live in Stockholm and in the northern parts of Sweden. But yeah, I think it's still a part of the Swedish nation. This was a very nerdy question for like that only people who live in the Nordic countries would actually care about. I'm sorry that we're talking about fucking Scania.
That's okay. All right, thank you very much. Here's another one. Again, keeping it international for a little while. Bex Levanis, something like this. Paul, thoughts on the Kosovo question?
I have a Twitter thread on this. If you go on my Twitter and scroll a little bit, you'll probably find it. But I'll keep it short here. I won't go in depth as I said there. But I think that the national self-determination of the Albanians in Kosovo needs to be defended, and that a socialist and new democratic revolution needs to be promoted in Kosovo. And like, yeah, that's pretty much it. Like, I don't think that Kosovo is an integral part of Serbia, and I think that the Albanian state, if they occupied Kosovo, would treat the non-Albanian minorities in Kosovo very badly, but that Kosovo is still a part of the Albanian nation as a like overall, you know. So I very much denounce greater Serbian chauvinism to say that Kosovo is a part of Serbia. And that's pretty much it. That's all I have to say here on the stream. But you can definitely go check out my thread on Twitter about Kosovo.
Yeah, and there should be a little link to your Twitter in the description box below, as well as a link to your YouTube channel. So people should definitely go subscribe and hear more of that Marxist-Leninist Maoist analysis. Okay, thank you very much, comrades. The Engels has asked a little while ago, I think earlier on the stream, it was phrased slightly differently. Paul and Vučko, what screwed over the Rim? And more recently, who destroyed the Rim, the revolutionary internationalist movement?
I guess the most of the guilt can be put on the weirdos in the RCP USA or the Avakianites. Because they very much saw the RCP, the RIM as their own personal little project where they would have the most control, and they were also the ones who had control over the newspaper A World to Win, and like they decided what got published there and like how many copies would get sent where. So it ended up like tearing the Rim apart because nobody really liked the Avakianites, and people just started not associating with the Rim after the Avakianites started becoming more and more Avakianite and pushing the so-called new synthesis, which was condemned by Comrade Ajit. It was also condemned by the PCP. It was condemned by the CPP. It was condemned by the CPI Maoist. And pretty much everybody has condemned the Avakianite revisionists. Yeah, basically. So that's the main reason why the Rim split.
Who destroyed Bob Vakin?
Bob Vakin, yeah.
Bob Vakin, single-handedly.
Single-handedly.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. Now, the next there's a couple more questions that we have here. Jess and I asked a little while ago, why do some Marxist-Leninists call Maoists ultra-left? And could you give the actual definition or an example of what ultra-left is? This is a tricky question to answer because ultra-left generally just means anyone to the left of me that I don't really like, you know. So it could mean anything, you know. It could mean, you know, your left communists. It could mean, you know, for some people it could mean like Trotskyists. For some people it could mean like Luxembourg Bordegists. Could mean any of these people. It could, for anyone, for other people it could be just any Maoist, you know. It could be the comrades in the Philippines, it could be the experiment in Peru, it could be people in India, like anything, you know. So it's still subjective. It's like, you know, when we look at like dialectics, it's like it's almost like you know, trying to define up without down, you know. It's again this left and right thing. You're always defining it in contrast to what it's not. So it's difficult to say what it is concretely. There are some characteristics that we can associate with it. You know, we can talk about like adventurism and things like that. We can
exactly.
We can pick up a copy of, let's say, for example, we can talk about like left opportunism. We can talk about things like that. We can pick up a copy of Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder by Lenin. We can get into that a little bit. Although that's something that people like to, you know, beat Maoists over the head with, you know, the electoral stuff.
God damn it, yeah.
All the time.
Lenin actually said we should participate in elections.
This is Lenin actually said you should vote for Joe Biden. You know, I read.
Oh, fucking headache.
So like but no, there is of course left opportunism. Often it's an overcorrection to right opportunism, but really, you know, when we talk about like adventurism, we're talking about like getting ahead of the masses. We're too far ahead of the masses. We want to do the impossible. We want to do things that aren't possible right now, you know. So being like, when we talk about like being a rightist, we're talking about being, you know, being behind the masses. You know, you don't want to push forward with communist movements. You're always like tailing behind the masses, whereas I think being a leftist is generally being too far ahead of the masses, demanding the impossible, you know.
An ultra leftist.
An ultra leftist, yeah. That's what I mean when I say.
Because like when we say leftist, when I say leftist, I mean like the left line in the actual party.
Yeah. Excuse me, I'm kind of mixing up a few different.
No, it's
things
fine.
there.
It's fine.
Yeah, you give a more. You could probably give a more coherent response than I.
No, like I agree with your response. Like ultra left is oftentimes just thrown around as one of those like, I'm gonna call them ultra left to prove that they're wrong.
Yeah. Shut the fuck up,
like,
ultra leftist.
Exactly. Ultra left Gonzaloite, Western chauvinist, NAD. Like my bio says on Twitter.
CIA propagandist.
Yeah, CIA. I'm employed by the CIA and NAD to destabilize the glorious People's Republic of China. But like, what you also said is also correct. Like that, we can see some general trends that can be classed as ultra leftism, which is like adventurism and such. But usually, the reason why Maoists are called ultra left is because they don't support China, or because they actually engage in revolution, and people are like, "Oh my God, you can't do that because, you know, the struggle in these countries isn't advanced enough to like engage in a revolution." It's basically the same line as the Mensheviks held towards the Bolshevik Revolution. They were like, "No, you can't have a socialist revolution in Russia. Russia isn't a developed capitalist country." You know, it's the same kind of line. And also, usually it's people here in the West who call out Maoists who promote electoral boycott, and are like, "Oh, you're so ultra left. Can't you see that like some reformism is good?" And like, which is a complete misunderstanding of the thing, because like electoralism doesn't mean reformism. Like there's way to push for reformism without using electoralism, which is usually how reformism actually happens. Like all of the major reforms that have happened in capitalist countries haven't been through electing the right people. They have been through like organizing strikes and like mass protests in order to get concessions from the bourgeoisie, you know. It usually hasn't been by, oh, let's just vote the right guy in.
Yeah.
And the bourgeoisie will totally listen to that. Instead, it's usually that these bourgeois parties form around the fact that there needs to be concessions towards the proletariat, you know.
Yeah, you know, it is interesting that you said, you know, like you mentioned, like different countries, they're just not ready for revolution. They will be ready in the future, but they're just not ready right now. You know, it's ultra leftist to assume that you can actually go out and engage in revolutionary activity. Let's just do some reform stuff. Let's just get the right guy in, and then we can push them to the left, and everything will be okay. You know, so yeah, this is an important point, because you can get too far ahead of the masses. You can get too far ahead of the masses, and that would be getting into adventurism. You know, you can get into like hyperactivism. You can get into stuff like that. That can be an issue. Or you can take like the right opportunist path of of going the total opposite direction, of staying behind the masses, of committing purely to reformist activity, whether that's electoral activity, or if it's just trying to maybe take more of like an economist perspective, where you're just kind of trying to do everything through the trade unions, not engaging in any revolutionary activity. So you can be too far ahead of the masses, and you can be in the ultra left category, or you can be too far behind the masses, and you're on more of like a rightist and right opportunist line. So that's generally a good way of thinking of things. You could be a Marxist Leninist and be an ultra leftist as well. I mean, this is something that people don't understand. They tend to say you're ultra left based on your ideology. That's not necessarily a good way of looking at things. For example, some people might describe like what Che Guevara and stuff like that, like Folkism, stuff like that, might describe that as ultra left as well. You know, adventurism and too far ahead of the masses and stuff like that. Now we can have that disagreement. We can get into that. That's a different conversation. But it's not just this ideology is ultra left, this ideology is rightist. Although there are some ideologies that would tend in those particular directions. So yeah, that's what I would say. It's basically just being ultra left is just being too far ahead of the masses, and being more of a rightist is being too far behind the masses. There's a quote about Mao. There's a Mao quote on this as well, where you know the one. Do you know the one I'm talking about, where he says like being. I think it's particularly regarding like, armed action. I think he's talking about like protracted People's War, and I think he's talking about if you don't attack. He's talking about particularly in the context of China. If you didn't
I
attack,
know exactly which quote you mean.
you know the one, yeah. He says like if you don't attack when the opportunity is right, then you're being like a rightist. You know, like you're being ahead, you're being behind the masses. Like the moment is right, the people are ready for it. But then like conversely, if you attack when there's no chance of winning, if you attack when the people aren't ready for it, then that's like adventurous, that's leftism and stuff like that. So yeah,
exactly.
So yeah, those are kind of some broad strokes attempts at answering the question. Hopefully you can
I agree with what you said about that. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much. Elijah Hammond asked a little while ago. This seems like I don't know how to answer this. Elijah Hammond, what's the difference between supporting revolutionary movements and being social imperialist? I don't even know how to. It's like, what's the difference between supporting socialists and supporting imperialists? Really, you know, what is a revolutionary movement? I mean, obviously, we're talking about revolutionary proletarian movements, and being social imperialists. That's kind of a tricky one. I mean, because the social imperialists, the countries that people would point to as social imperialists, according to Maoists, we would not consider them to be revolutionary. You know, people might make an argument that they're like reformists or something like that, and other people can have that conversation, but they're two very different, you know, areas, two very different topics, you know, and this is kind of so I don't know, did you want to try and answer that, Vučko?
Well, the difference is that one of them develops productive forces and the other one doesn't. Obviously. No, but like to answer it more seriously is that like a social imperialist country doesn't support revolutionary movements. We can see this in the case of China, where it supports various reactionary governments and such in order to like consolidate its rule in these areas. And that's essentially the biggest difference, because like the difference is that supporting revolutionary movements and being social imperialist are two completely different things. There is like, it's like comparing apples and pears, you know?
Yeah.
It's just like, there's not really a comparison there.
No, there's not. It's What's the difference? I mean, really, it's like, what's the difference between supporting socialists and supporting capitalists? You know, because that's like when people talk about social imperialists. Actually, it probably is worth delineating. Like when we talk about socialist imperialist, social imperialist we're talking about people. We're talking about countries that are actually imperialists, but they call themselves socialist. You know, so when you call it social imperialist,
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
saying, of course, it behaves a little bit differently because of that. Because it's social imperialist, it kind of has to, you know, maintain a facade. It has to have, like, wave the red flag and, you know, talk about productive forces and talk about Marx and stuff like that in order to maintain things. But ultimately, it's just imperialist. It's just imperialism. You know, largely in broad strokes. So that's it. I mean, what's the difference between supporting anti-imperialism versus supporting imperialism? You know, two very different things. You know.
yeah, exactly. Because like, if maybe the comrade is like mistaking and thinking that like when the USSR under Stalin or China under Mao supported revolutionary movements, that could be considered
Ah, okay.
social imperialism. But like, I don't like the problem there is that you're like confusing the fundamental difference between a socialist country and an imperialist country. Like, even if an imperialist country claims to be socialist and supports these movements, it's usually for its own interest, and it usually even doesn't even support these kind of movements. The social imperialist USSR did support some so-called socialist movements, such as the military regime of Derg in Ethiopia, which claimed to be socialist, as well as like the regime they propped up in Afghanistan, and like other satellite states of the USSR, uh, which is like a bit different to what China does today. But like, we have to also recognize that these countries were never actually socialist. Instead, they were just like puppets of the social imperialist USSR that served its interests in the region.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think we'll take maybe two more questions, and then I think we'll wrap this up here. So Space Marks asked another question. Thank you, Space Marks, for asking a few more questions. Good to see you again. Do you think the Maoist movement will see an upsurge in the southern parts of Asia after the protracted People's Wars? Any thoughts on that?
I definitely think that there will be an upsurge. However, we see this upsurge already happening in Latin America and not in Southeast Asia or South Asia. I do think the southern parts of Asia will see an upsurge if the Philippine Revolution does succeed, which it eventually will. But like right now, we're seeing an upsurge definitely in, for example, Brazil and in Ecuador primarily. We're seeing an upsurge in like Maoist activity and organizing towards a people's war, uh, which is the development that I'm most interested in, to be honest, because
Hmm.
that's the only countries that where I'm actually seeing Maoist movements develop to the same scale as in the countries where there's already ongoing people's wars. And also I think that it would strengthen the people's war in Turkey definitely.
Hmm. All right, brilliant. Thank you very much. And we'll take one final question. Now, here's a question that I'm very curious about. I've been meaning to learn more about the Nepalese Maoist and what happened there. I know there's
Mm.
been some issues and the Prashanda stuff. I know they got more into kind of an electoral thing as time went on, but I'm really interested to hear your position on this. Happy Chulo asks, Paul, thoughts on the Nepalese Maoists and their turn to reformism? What can be learned from the Nepalese revolution?
Don't trust people who like the thing is like the Nepalese movement never really started with the point of conquering power. I think it actually the people who were there started because of a dispute between the party and the government, and it always had the character of sort of being like armed struggle for concessions.
Hmm.
It only later on started to sort of gain the character of a proper people's war. Um, but like it never really like kicked off the same way as in Peru or India or the Philippines with the specific purpose of building new democracy. Uh, and of course, the leadership betrayed the revolution with Parashanda at its head, and he became a revisionist. And today, he is one of the leaders for the reactionary state, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. I think he isn't the prime minister anymore, but he used to be prime minister. And yeah, he just became a total, complete revisionist. And today, there are some groups of Maoists who is still engaged in armed struggle. However, there is no clear party that is leading them. There used to be one that was under the leadership of a guy called Biplav, and they also recently signed a peace deal with the government. And I never really had hope for them. Some comrades online did have hope for them, but I have some comrades here in Sweden who are very educated on the Nepalese question, and they explained to me that like you can't really trust any so-called Maoist party until they prove what they're worth, despite the fact, no matter how much they call for armed struggle, until they wage armed struggle until victory, we can't really trust them because of how many different groups claim to be Maoist in Nepal, when in reality they are just like fighting for concessions and not for actual total victory over semi-feudalism and semi-colonialism.
All right, brilliant. Thank you very much. Listen, Vučko, I really, really appreciate you coming on and for having this conversation.
It was a pleasure, man.
Thank you, and for talking us out, and also for dealing with the, from the very start, dealing with like the most difficult questions and the most horrific kind of, allegations and accusations that are leveled at the Peruvian people's struggle. And I appreciate you dealing with those issues head on and tackling them that way. So I appreciate that. To all the comrades who are checking us out, I would just say, when analyzing this, when trying to come to terms with what happens in Peru, trying to figure it out, just apply the same level of scrutiny to it that you would to Vietnam and to any of these other struggles, to the Bolshevik struggle, to the Chinese struggle. Apply the same level of scrutiny to that, and then you'll probably have a much better and clearer understanding than often the hysteria that we're fed from bourgeois media sources and stuff.
Yeah.
Do you have any?
Before we,
I
just have a closing little quote to read before we head off to go to bed.
Yeah, please.
In preparation for May Day tomorrow.
Yes, absolutely.
Which I'm looking forward to. This comes from the document from the PCP called "Nothing and Nobody Can Defeat Us."
Amazing, absolutely.
Yeah.
So
this is the quote: "As a fighter of this heroic, shining trench of combat, who has resisted tenaciously the bombing of the reactionary genocidal armed forces, dishonor of the national heroes. Brave to kill, cowardly to die. They know how to kill, but don't know how to die. The people will never forget the blood shed from its best children. Beloved people from around the world, your communist children of war will not fail you. Especially at this moment, we will hoist the red flags of communism. We have bright prospects. What can we do? Well, our destiny is to succeed. The last word is that we are winning. We fight clearly for our cause, for communism. We'll talk about other issues on another day. I reaffirm my commitment to our revolution, to the world revolution, with the blood of our people, of our brave fighters, with the blood of our communist comrades that flows freely, crumbling the old and creating the new. Never again will I see their faces, their smiles, but that lives within my heart. I will be the bearer of its ideals that are mine, that are our people. I will follow your examples to fight for our people, to serve the people, wholeheartedly, without any personal motive, with complete selflessness. Long live Chairman Gonzalo, guarantee of victory. Long live the Communist Party of Peru. Glory to the fallen fighters." This was sent in by a fighter on June 19th, 1986, which is now known as the Day of Heroism, which is when the reactionary Peruvian state committed genocide against several hundred comrades who were interned in the concentration camps in El Fronton prison, in Callao and other naval bases, and they were massacred en masse. And this fighter sent in this letter to the Central Committee, which they published as a final memorandum for him, because this comrade also passed away in the massacre that happened, and this was his final words, pretty much. And it really touched my heart to read that.
Yeah, really, really powerful stuff, and thank you for reading that out, and I hope the comrades appreciated that. Yeah, solidarity for International Workers' Day.
Hmm.
Workers of the
I
world
hope everyone has
unite.
a great Workers' Day.
We have nothing to lose but our chains. just just before we fully wrap up, was there anything else that you wanted to shout out before we fully close this off? Did you want to say anything with any, like, if you have any
Mm.
work coming up, if there's any like movements or demonstrations, anything at all that you want to shout out? And
Mm.
now's your chance.
I'll take a moment to talk about a bit about the situation in Brazil.
Great,
Uh,
brilliant.
the reactionary state of Brazil is planning a new massacre to commit against the Poor Peasants League in Brazil that are fighting for land rights and for new democracy. And it is the duty of every progressive and every revolutionary in every country to raise opinion on this question, to make sure that it's well known in the bourgeois, even in the bourgeois press, that the Brazilian state is a rotten state that is planning a massacre against its own people. And this requires solidarity work. This requires non-ideological work that is on the fronts. And this is something that all communists must take up. As for my own personal projects, I'm currently trying to work on a video about Jefatura, and that it kind of goes a little more in depth to explaining the origins and stuff. However, it is going to take a while because I have a lot of stuff to do, finish up with school, because it's like the final few weeks. And those are usually always the ones that are filled with exams and like stuff that has to be turned in the very last minute. So it's going to take a bit. Like, it'll probably be published around the middle of May, the next video. But I recommend people keep track of my Twitter, because that's where I'm usually post about my opinions, and my DMs are usually very open, so people can talk to me there. Yeah.
Great. All right, brilliant. And you'll find a little link to that in the description box below this. So get over there, follow Comrade Vučko on Twitter, on YouTube, and let people know about what's going on in Brazil. This is really important. Show solidarity, and let's do what we can to prevent the horrific fascist state violence against the people. All right, comrades, thanks very much for being here. Have a lovely weekend. We'll wrap things up there. And yeah, red salute, solidarity. Cheers, everyone. August Slán go fóill. Take care.